overview. My favorite color is that red.
All right. So just as backdrop, I guess today's meeting we sort of want to give you an example of what we're trying to look for in the project. Because like last time we gave like a broad framework. We might have like more specific questions. Obviously, this framework is pretty flexible. You have a lot of control over what your own project is, what you want to do, and feel free to come discuss with Ben and I what you want to take in terms of the direction of your project.
So this is just what we're going to do today. We want to first have a brief overview of what macroeconomics is about, and then we'll have a sample economic indicator for you and some research sources that we suggest you use just to help you out with finding data, maybe doing some analysis.
Yeah. So how did you guys have started thinking about what indicators or what sectors you want to look into? All right. So a couple of you guys. So hopefully at the end of this presentation, we'll be giving you some resources where you can take a look. It's just like a lot of different data, a lot of sources where you can just dive in and see what's out there, and then from there you might be able to better evaluate, better eliminate what you don't want and choose what you do want.
Right. So, what is macroeconomics? Does anyone know what the origins of the field is? Where it comes from? So basically, in modern economics, a common way to classify economics into two kind of separate fields is microeconomics and macroeconomics. And most of you probably know the distinction between the two. So the first one, so microeconomics focuses on the economics of individual subjects like household, individual, company, firm, whereas macroeconomics focuses on aggregate, the aggregates, so production, unemployment, stuff like that. Yeah.
So as you might know from the name of our group, macro analysis group, we are more thinking about macro perspective. So whenever you look at your indicators, so these indicators generally are more macroeconomically skewed, so they try to evaluate how the economy is doing as a whole. So when you're doing your project, you want to think about how you're going to relate what your findings are back to the general macroeconomic environment. So key economists to think about, what is important about that whole is we want you to also keep in mind sort of what theoretically should happen, right? You have like Phillips curves, you have the Beveridge curve, like a lot of these different curves that you might learn about in your econ classes. And sometimes they might apply in like empirics, sometimes they might not. So it might be interesting to also take a look at what is being said theoretically and compare that to the data.
I think if we go to the next slide, there are a couple of definitions from the American Economics Association and the New York Fed of what macroeconomics is, and basically highlighted are the main topics of interest or ideas that sort of important. So things like unemployment, economic growth, inflation, and national incomes. So basically, whenever you're doing your research on whatever indicator it is, always keep in mind that we're trying to, in the end, interpret them, and the analysis should be focused on relating it back to the macroeconomic climate. So things like economic growth, unemployment, things of that nature.
Yeah, so when it comes to sort of selecting your topic too, these might be really good places to start off, right? So you look at unemployment, then you might research what is affecting unemployment. Maybe the housing market is affecting interest rates or something like that. So you want to dive in and see what your interests lay, what might be interesting for you to sort of research. So now we just want to go into sort of a sample economic indicator, give you some of the questions that we would think about when we approach the project, sort of give it a little demo.
Yeah. So we're going to look at the PMI, which is a Purchasing Managers Index. it's a well-known indicator, and these are just the steps of analysis that we're going to take you through.
Yeah.
So, who collects data, who releases the indicator and statistic, something that you should know. How frequently it is released, and when, on what day, whether there's specific calendars to the indicator. Usually there is. How the indicator is reported and how it's calculated, what data is collected. Yeah. So we're gonna basically all these steps. So the PMI indicator is collected. So in the U.S., there's the Institute of Supply Management, and they basically release the indicator. And there's a market group, and they release the PMI indicator for a large amount of other nations, as well as the U.S. So for the Eurozone and BRICS. So this is basically who releases the statistic.
Yeah, so if you want to find data, you want to find more about it, you probably would go to these as the primary resources to figure out that. So how frequently? So you might have indicators that are released monthly, some indicators released quarterly. These are sort of important to know. It sort of affects how the data is correlated to sort of ups and downs in the economy, like whether the seasonal effects might affect some changes in the data. So for the PMI, it is released on the first business day of every month. So it's a monthly indicator, and it reports the PMI. So every month they report the PMI of the previous month.
So this is just how the index is actually calculated. What happens is there's a survey, and so the market group or the ISM, they send out surveys to 400 or more, depending on the size of the manufacturing sector in the country. 400 or more surveys to, I guess, random managers, and they're asked questions where they can answer either below, the same, or above, and there are different classifications for the questions, and basically this is how they're weighted. So this is something that is more, this might give you an idea of what to compare the indicator to when you're doing your analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also important to know, specifically for PMI, that it's on a scale from 0 to 100. So what they do is, when they conduct the survey, essentially they ask them, so are conditions the same? Are they not? Are they decreasing or are they improving? And then when they actually do the calculation, they set a number. So a 0 is it's decreasing, a 0.5 is no change, and then a 1 is it's increasing. And then essentially they find the percentage of people that they surveyed who answered each one and do a sort of a weighted average of that. So if you have like a 50, that means that no change happened from last month in terms of expectations for purchasing managers. But then if you have above 50, that's usually more positive news. And if you have below 50, likewise, negative news. So it's important that when you're looking at your indicator, you want to understand how they're calculating, what's the significance of their calculation methods, and then what does that tell you about the data. You want to be able to interpret the data. And obviously, from your econ classes, like GEP is calculated differently, so it's like this is not going to be a generalized process. This is going to be part of the research that you conduct. You have to figure out how they're calculating these indicators. So, so this we sort of touched upon this. They take surveys from 400 purchasing managers in the country, and they have those three options.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this
Yeah.
as well. So PMI about 50 indicates that the manufacturing sector is expanding. So just to clarify, there are different PMIs as well. So there's a manufacturing PMI, which is the one we're looking at here, and there's also a service PMI. So basically, the indicator is trying to show whether the sector is expanding or contracting. So if it's above above 50, it's expanding, so there's more economic activity, which should contribute to translate into economic growth. If there's contraction, it's the opposite. It can indicate economic slowdown.
So this next slide, it's a little bit open-ended about weaknesses versus strengths. So when you are selecting your indicator, not only do you want to know what this indicator is telling you, but you want to see if there's any other indicators that are comparable, right? So you have inflation, you have like CPI, but there's also another indicator called PCE, or personal consumption expenditures. They're both measures of inflation, but they're calculated differently. They have different scales. So you want to understand what else is out there. And maybe there's another indicator that might be better than your indicator in terms of how they're calculating it. So this is really going to be a portion of your research. You want to figure out what else is out there and really solidify the reason for you choosing your indicator. And it's also okay for you to maybe select 3 of these indicators and see how all of them interact with each other. So usually like CPI might overestimate inflation while PCE underestimates inflation. So knowing these differences could be helpful for your research. Anything?
Yeah. So this is just a simple analysis. So one of the questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're doing the manufacturing PMI is, does the size of the manufacturing sector in a given country matter? So you would expect just intuitively that if a country, like for example, if the manufacturing sector is 40% of the whole economy, the PMI is a better indicator of economic growth. So if PMI is well above 50 and the manufacturing is expanding, then you would expect the GDP to be expanding as well. If a country is smaller and has smaller manufacturing sector that's only 10 or even under 10% of the whole economy, you might expect it to not be as well correlated with the GDP growth rate. So you could look at different countries, as an example, China or Israel. So in China, they manufacture a lot. You would expect PMI to be, highly correlated with the growth rate. And also, you might look at developed countries versus developing countries.
So this is obviously going to be a lot more flexible for your project. These are just some of the questions that we posed for the PMI index. You can do a lot more, be more catered towards what index that you're choosing and what that indicator is measuring. Yep, so just a demo of what we did with one of the questions.
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at 4 different countries: China, Russia, Spain, and Eurozone. Obviously Spain is in the Eurozone, but we wanted to compare those. We looked at the manufacturing sector as a percent of GDP, and we compared the movements in the PMI, the monthly movements, to the quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rates. So GDP is reported differently. One of the ways that it's reported is quarter-on-quarter, and there are 4 quarters in a year. So basically, what you're going to be looking at, and you have to understand this as well, the kind of data that you're working with. The PMI is reported 12 times a year. The GDP only makes a movement 4 times a year. So you expect to see more sort of movements in the PMI than in GDP. What else?
Yeah, so some of the other questions, right? Is there a strong correlation or is there a lag in the movement? Some of these are questions that you want to think about when you're actually, before you approach it, and then see if the data that you use is affirming what it's telling you about the questions. So.
Yeah, so this is from the World Bank, and here you can see the size of the manufacturing sector as a percent of GDP. So obviously in China it's about 32%. In Russia it is about 17%, and in the Eurozone it's below 15%. So, in Spain.
Yeah. And also something I just want to bring to your attention. You notice how China sort of stops in 2011. So as you might know, in some countries it might be harder to get economic data than other countries. Some countries might only release data like a couple years out. So that might also be a consideration when you're choosing what you want to look at in terms of what data is actually out there and how you're going to be able to access that data.
So these are just some sample graphs where we put, the movements in PMI and the growth rate. So the first one is for China, and as you can see, there's so the blue line is the GDP and the PMI is the black line. So you can see that the movements in PMI give they don't correlate one-to-one, but basically there's sort of a lag between the movement and the PMI and GDP. So you can see the PMI is decreasing and then it's below 50, which means that the manufacturing sector is contracting. And you can see at the same time that the quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rate is also declining. And this happens, pretty much across from 2011 to 2014. So for China, looking at the PMI, the manufacturing PMI in China can be, give you a lot of information about what's going to happen to the growth rate. The second one is for Spain, and here you see a smoother relationship. But there is also definitely a relationship between the PMI and the growth rate. Yeah. Then for Russia, it's not as good of an indicator because you can see that the growth rate is the PMI is contracting pretty much from the beginning of 2012 to 2014, but the growth rate is still positive, and there isn't. It's hard to tell from just looking at the graph whether looking at the PMI is going to give you a good idea of what's going to happen to the GDP growth rate in Russia. Whereas in the EU, it's similar to Spain. So there, it's a better indicator. So this is just sort of a qualitative analysis. Things to remember again is correlation does not imply causation. So just because PMI is increasing doesn't mean that that's what's causing the growth rate. But just by looking at the graph, and if over a long period of time, over 4 years, there's been simultaneous movements, then it might be a good indicator.
And obviously, this is pretty basic, right, in terms of data. You collect the data, you plot it out, look at what the data is telling you, see these sort of increases, decreases, and there's a lot more technical tools that you can use. You might do like more statistical analysis or run regressions to try to prove things. And we didn't include that here, but that's obviously fair ground for everyone to delve into. We hope that you are able to do that because using some of those more technical analysis will just boost your own conclusions and also be something good to talk about.
Right, but this is definitely also something that you can do. So if you're not familiar with a lot of statistical software or statistical analysis, or it's difficult to just find data to work with, then some of the websites provide you with what the tools to sort of make these graphs. And we're going to show you a demonstration of how you can actually construct these graphs just like this in 30 seconds.
All right, so I guess just the last slide here, some research resources that you want to think about. So we segmented them into like primary resources and secondary resources. So primary, that's the actual people who are conducting the surveys, who are collecting the data, publishing the data. So you have the primary survey producers. So in terms of PMI, that would be the market group, etc. And then the St. Louis Federal Reserve has a really good site called the Federal Reserve Economics Data. It's called FRED. And what essentially they do is they compile a bunch of data from different agencies all together. So it's very easy. They have like a search bar and you can search there. So it's easy to compare between what. So you like put in housing and it'll just pop up a bunch of housing indicators. So that might be better for you if you don't know exactly what indicator you want to look at, but you know what section you want to look at. And then similarly, Training Economics has a similar resource, and they call it iEconomics. it just looks a lot better though than the Fed. And then secondary resources are people who sort of take a look at the data and they provide their own conclusions about it. They tell you, they have their own interpretations of why this indicator might be important. And those are always good resources to take a look at to just develop your own understanding beyond the primary resources. So some of them are like Investopedia, Bloomberg, and this WordPress site has some good information. And then obviously Wikipedia, you know, you're not restricted. Feel free to use Wikipedia. Just make sure to be cautious when you're on Wikipedia, as always.
And I'll just show them how to construct,
Yeah,
some of
the
So we looked at PMI and GDP growth rate. So we can look at PMI and unemployment rate, for example, and we can do it for the U.S. So this is Trading Economics. It's a website that has a lot of data, and it's free to look at it on the website. You can take screenshots, but downloading any data is not free. Okay, let's click on United States. Search for PMI, manufacturing PMI. Let's make it a line graph. Give that to 2012. Here we can compare it to some other countries as well if you like it. And we can compare it to the unemployment rate. So here you see, this is just the same type of graph, and they have the negative. So if the PMI is above 50 or well above 50, the unemployment goes down, as you might expect, because the manufacturing sector is expanding and they're hiring more people because they need to produce more. So this is just very simple analysis that you can do just by looking at this graph. And you can do this for many other indicators that they have here.
So this is obviously a good resource, very easy to use, really easy to digest the data. Right, so I guess at this point, that sort of ends our mini demo. Obviously, it's pretty flexible in terms of your own things. So, do you guys have any questions about it? Yeah.
So do you want us to start looking at a topic this week?
Yeah, so next weekend I will be here and I'll actually be recording. So by next weekend we want you to solidify what sector you are and preferably the indicator or set of indicators that you're going to be looking at. Obviously this will probably change. Like if you look at this indicator, you spend like a week or two looking at it and you're like, wait, there's actually another indicator that I want to look at instead of this one. We're flexible about that, but we definitely want you to just really get started on the process by next week. So I'll be here, and then I will probably be recording what everyone's doing, just to see sort of the distribution of different parts of the economy that everyone's going to be looking at.
But also, the things you want us to look at, do you want it to be like more of a what's currently going on rather than a research-based, like something that already happened in the past?
So at the end of this semester, the goal is we're compiling everyone's reports together into something about like what the current economy is looking like and what the future will look like. Obviously, that doesn't mean there's no room for historical analysis, right? Like if that historical analysis is relevant for today, then feel free to include it. All right, anything else? All good? Yeah, so if you guys, there's a lot of resources there for you guys to sort of understand your topics. If you have any additional questions, feel free to talk to Ben and I about that. Yeah, but that concludes the meeting for this week. And next week's meeting is not going to be too intensive. As I said, it's just going to be recording what your topics are. So I think you would just need to drop it.